Welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, April 23rd, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. While we're preoccupied with presidential politics, our government is killing people around the world. International polls show that it's the United States, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel, that is by far the most feared government in the world. And that's not surprising. Our government is today making war in 8 countries, and U.S. war provocations against Russia and China risk a wider, even a nuclear war. Although most Americans are not aware of it, the U.S. government is today making war, killing people, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. We're doing so principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. The ongoing U.S. drone assassination program, called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, has killed thousands of people, most of them not the presumed targets, including American citizens and hundreds of children. More than 250,000 American troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them surrounding Russia and China. The 70,000 U.S. troops in the Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities have included kidnapping, the U.S. government calls it rendition, torture, and murder. The U.S. is torturing the people of Venezuela, the country with the world's largest reserve of oil, in order to overthrow their government, which isn't following orders from Washington. Since 1945, the United States has killed more than 20 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, the Mideast, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic dominance that the U.S. inherited at the end of World War II for the American 1%. It is shamefully the basis of U.S. foreign policy to use war and the threats of war to retard the economic development of Russia and China as competitors to American control of the world economy. From U.S. support for a fascist coup in Ukraine to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea, and a huge NATO military buildup in Eastern Europe. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, we call upon the President and our government to close all foreign military bases, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income, for Americans who've been made poorer by generations of our government's wars. Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort is on Facebook at Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Chastened by the long-awaited Mueller report, the U.S. corporate media have been forced to partially abandon their ludicrous claim of collusion between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. But the civil war within the U.S. ruling class will continue to simmer because it's rooted in a fear that Trump cannot be depended on to keep up the momentum of President Obama's global military offensive and thus disrupt the rise of China and its strategic ally, Russia. The American oligarchy are painfully aware that U.S. imperialism has been drained of whatever soft power it once had in the world and left with only 2 cards to play: multi-theater unremitting military aggression and full-spectrum weaponization of the dollar. Regime change is the localized manifestation of Washington's desperate bid to upend and disrupt the emerging new global order as China returns to its historical place at the center of the world, the position it held when Columbus embarked on his pillages. Therefore, although Donald Trump has gotten a respite from Mueller, the orchestrated demonization of Russia, China, Venezuela, Syria, and socialism will remain the daily fare of the U.S. propaganda machine that masquerades as journalism. In other words, a step back to normal. The New York Times can thus continue to personalize its new Cold War hysteria with Putin bashing, while leaving Trump out of it. For example, in an article this month entitled Russia's Military Mission Creep Advances to a New Front, Africa, the Times claims that, quote, expanding Moscow's military sway on the continent reflects Mr. Putin's broader vision of returning Russia to its former glory, close quote. The piece is sheer polemics disguised as journalism, citing recent Russian military cooperation with Guinea, Burkina Faso, Burundi, and Madagascar, and Russian major oil and gas interests in Algeria, Angola, Egypt, Libya, Senegal, South Africa, Uganda, and Nigeria as grave threats to stability, in Africa. Yet in a 1,500-word article, the Times fails to even mention AFRICOM, the U.S. military command that has virtually occupied the entire continent since its inception in 2008, climaxing with President Obama's 2011 assault on Libya that plunged the whole northern tier of the region into flames. By 2017, according to journalist Nick Turse, AFRICOM was conducting 3,500 exercises, programs, and engagements per year, an average of nearly 10 missions per day on the African continent. Nothing Russia has done in Africa comes close to Washington's deep penetration of the continent. Yet the Times writes that the, quote, the United States military has a relatively light footprint across Africa, close quote. The U.S. and Europe fund and oversee every African peacekeeping mission, including the conflict in Somalia, where the CIA directs a full-scale drone war that's been dramatically escalated under President Trump. In the 8 years that Barack Obama was president, AFRICOM went from 3 military bases to 84 bases on the African continent. 6 million Congolese have died as a result of interventions by neighboring U.S.-backed regimes in Rwanda and Uganda, with the full complicity of Washington. Under U.S. and Israeli tutelage, Africa's largest nation, Sudan, was split in two in 2011, only to see South Sudan erupt in a civil war 2 years later that has killed nearly 40,000 people. The United States and France overcame their imperial rivalry in Africa and have partnered to occupy Mali and Niger, where 4 U.S. Special Forces troops were killed in 2017, and the U.S. is building a huge drone base. The U.S. military footprint is heavier and wider by far than any other nation, but the New York Times apparently feels confident in stating as fact that the U.S. has a light footprint in Africa, because that's what AFRICOM's top brass has been saying since 2012. Therefore, it must be true, despite the numbers that say differently. Nick Turse, whose reporting got him blackballed by AFRICOM's high command, wrote in 2018 that the U.S. maintained, quote, 34 sites scattered across the continent with high concentrations in the north and west, as well as the Horn of Africa, close quote. The biggest military facility is located in Djibouti, a desperately poor country that's been turned into a foreign base for the U.S., France, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and China. Beijing and Tokyo's only bases in Africa, purportedly to patrol against piracy on the Somali coast. Russia has no bases in Africa, but is said to be exploring establishing one in the Central African Republic, the former French colony where the U.S. briefly imprisoned Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide after overthrowing his elected government in 2004. The talks between Moscow and Bangui have caused consternation in Washington and Paris, anxieties that have been relayed to the New York Times, with full confidence that the paper's private sector propagandists are better liars than any military press spokesperson. The Times dutifully writes that France's Minister of Armed Forces is unhappy. Quote, "We feel very much concerned by the growing Russian influence in a country that we know well, the Central African Republic," the French minister told reporters during a recent visit to Washington. Yes, France knows the country well because it oppressed and exploited the Central African people for generations. So Africa is swarming with U.S. troops stationed at bases throughout the continent, second only to the French presence in the region. But the Times can say with a straight face that the U.S. Africa Command has a light footprint, while the baseless Vladimir Putin dreams of returning Russia to its former glory through a more militaristic approach in Africa, in the words of an American general. There should be little doubt that Russia, the second biggest arms merchant in the world, behind the U.S., is actively seeking African markets for its weapons. What scares the U.S. is that African nations like Guinea, Burkina Faso, Burundi, and Madagascar want to do arms and training deals with Russia to diversify their defense suppliers and create a multipolar environment in Africa. U.S. imperialism tolerates only one pole, its own, and instructs its media mouthpieces to vilify all competitors. But the U.S. cannot compete economically with Russia's partner, China, whose trade with Africa surpassed the United States in 2009. African states are eager to become part of China's New Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, the world's greatest public works, transportation, and trade project, which offers Africa unprecedented connectivity to the planet's economic center in the East. The U.S. has nothing to offer Africa but guns, drones, and extended half-life for the neocolonial order. And Russia can cut a better deal on guns. The New York Times and the rest of the corporate media tell tales that only Americans believe in service of a crumbling imperial racist order. The U.S. media bubble is a scary place, populated by demons and villains that are determined to steal or destroy an American way of life that most Americans, especially black folks, have never lived. Having nothing to offer the people but endless war and austerity, the American oligarchs invent enemies, complete with full-blown fictitious pathologies, conjured histories, and fabricated motives. Amid the imperial rot, the oligarchs turn on each other, as they did in 2016 in a fit of panic called Russiagate. A deep state referee named Mueller has called for a pause in the fratricide among the corporate brethren, but that can only signal an intensification of the lies that corporate media tell against external enemies and actual dissidents on the home front. In decline, the American oligarchy have no good stories to tell. To the extent that they control the domestic narrative, everything becomes slander. In the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump ran as a different kind of Republican, an opponent of the Iraq War, and an anti-interventionist who wanted to get along with Russia's Vladimir Putin and get out of these Middle East wars. But in office, the president has reversed his position. Trump had talked of pulling all U.S. troops out of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Yet the troops are still there. Although Trump came into office promising to get along with the Russians, he sent Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine and announced a pullout from Ronald Reagan's 1987 INF treaty that outlawed all land-based intermediate-range nuclear missiles. Now, remarkably enough, the center of gravity of U.S. politics is shifting towards the Trump position of 2016. And the anti-interventionist wing of the GOP is growing. And when added to the anti-interventionist and anti-war wing of the Democratic Party, together they are able, as on the Yemen War Powers resolution, to produce a new bipartisan majority. By the primaries of 2020, foreign policy will be front and center, and the Democratic Party will have captured the no more wars political high ground that candidate Donald Trump occupied in 2016. Or it is suggested. Perhaps that's so. But at the moment, both the Republican and Democrat parties are committed to war, and only minor parties, Greens and Libertarians, and Democratic candidate Tulsi Gabbard are opposing U.S. war crimes. Vote for them to save America's honor if you have the chance. Our research, you are watching Aware on the Air, and in the next few minutes, we will turn to a piece to which our researcher J.B. Nicholson directs us, Jimmy Dore's interview of Aaron Matei, the best reporter on Russiagate, and writes, J.B. Nicholson writes as follows, "There's a lot of this interview that's worth watching and talking about. Early on, they also cover Bill Binney's work debunking the Russiagate narrative that the DNC, Democratic National Committee, emails were hacked and not leaked. Matei admits he's not a technical computer user, so he doesn't really understand Binney's explanation. But I think that's down to Binney not explaining it well for non-technical users, not because anything Binney said is wrong or somehow impossible. That's the judgment of our own computer specialist, J.B. Nicholson. Quite the contrary, Binney's experiment is repeatable, demonstrable, and eminently sensible method, which points very much to a leak. An insider with server access locally copying data to a convenient drive, such as a USB thumb drive, and then sending a copy of the data from there to WikiLeaks. We're talking about the supposed Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee email. It never happened. It was a leak, not a hack. And this is what the former NSA official William Binney shows and is described in the interview that I'm quoting from here. Our researcher goes on, therefore it's completely possible that Seth Rich did exactly that, and that's the reason he was killed. And that's also the reason his murder isn't being investigated, and that's why his murder was described as a robbery gone wrong, distraction away from the available facts. We know he was a DNC employee. He had Democratic National Committee. He had DNC server access. He had the skill to do the task, and he was killed in the street, and despite the initial claim of a robbery gone bad, nothing was stolen from the corpse. The point is that this is how these materials got to WikiLeaks, not because of some Russian hacker. On the WikiLeaks side, there's this from an interview in November 2016. Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, said, "The Clinton camp has been able to project a neo-McCarthyist hysteria that Russia is responsible for everything. Hillary Clinton has stated multiple times falsely that 17 U.S. intelligence agencies had assessed that Russia was the source of our publications, WikiLeaks publications. That's false. We can say that the Russian government is not the source." Direct denial of the account that was put about by the Clinton campaign that the pilfered emails came from Russian cyber intelligence. The interviewer says to Assange, "So in other words, let me be clear. Russia did not give you the Podesta documents or anything from the DNC?" Julian Assange answers, "That's correct. We're unhappy that we felt that we needed to even say that it wasn't a state party. Normally, we say nothing at all. We have a strong interest in protecting our sources, and so we never say anything about them, never ruling anyone in or anyone out. And so here, in order to prevent a distraction attack against our publications, we've had to come out and say, no, it's not a state party. Stop trying to distract it that way, and pay attention to the content of our publications, close quote. Close quote. WikiLeaks has never lied about what their publications are, and I have no evidence to back up the idea that WikiLeaks lies about their sources. Granted, they don't release information on sources. They're the one organization one should leak to if one is going to leak at all. So says our researcher. Regarding the downfall of alternative media outlets, Aaron Maté mentions he couldn't get his Russiagate analysis articles published at The Intercept either. If you recall, he publicly posted tweets, some of which he recalled, that he quit Democracy Now! And The Real News over the same disagreement. Jimmy Dore, in interviewing Aaron Maté, says, but that's what most of the people in journalism are about. They're about their career, and they don't have a lot of courage. Because that's what it takes to do this. It took a lot of guts to stick your chin out and do this, and thank God you found someone like Katrina vanden Heuvel over at The Nation to champion your writing, Maté's writing. Otherwise, you would have been spending your time, you and me, over on our YouTube channel, and nobody would have been getting awards. Aaron Maté responds, it's true. Listen, I can tell you that I tried to write this stuff at The Intercept. It wasn't welcome there. I wrote one piece about Rachel Maddow. You covered this on your show. I wrote that piece about Rachel Maddow, talking about how she covered Russia more than all other issues combined, and going through and debunking a lot of her conspiracy theories, basically arguing very politely that she was a propagandist. That piece did very well, but after that I was never welcome back at The Intercept again. And I tried, and I thought that of all outlets, an outlet that calls itself fearless and adversarial, as The Intercept does, would want to put resources that challenge the claims of intelligent officials like John Brennan and challenging this conspiracy theory that was so widespread across the corporate media. But they weren't interested. And instead, they went and hired Jim Risen. Jimmy Dore at this point throws his head back and laughs and says, Jim Risen, who famously misused the word treason, said publicly and on articles published on The Intercept that the president was guilty of treason, that he was a traitor. There were no attempt to soften the words. It was pointed out to him on video that he was misusing the word treason. He admitted he was misusing it and then said he didn't care. He's going to keep misusing it, and because words aren't that important to journalists like Jim Risen, when he's angry at someone like Donald Trump, he reveals all the cracks in his personality. A guy like Trump revealed every crack in Jim Risen's personality, and it was shown a light on, and that guy fell down harder on the job than anybody. And I wish he would quit doing what he's doing. That's Jimmy Dore commenting on the remarkable figure of Jim Risen at The Intercept. Maté says, and to The Intercept's credit, they do publish Glenn Greenwald, who pushed back on Russiagate from the beginning before I did, Maté. It was pretty much him and Bob Perry, the late Bob Perry of Consortium News, a legend. So Glenn and Bob Perry were among the first, and so Glenn deserves a lot of credit. The Intercept cannot take credit for what Glenn did because Glenn has autonomy. He does whatever he wants, and they have nothing to do with what he did. Dore asks, who are the people you work for at The Intercept? Who are your editors that said no? Maté replied, I'm not going to get into the individuals, but the point is, institutionally, there was a decision that this website does, and this website that does such great work. I love The Intercept, actually. I think it's a great website. But in this key issue, the one that was engulfing our politics, I think they could maybe argue to the contrary if they want to, but I think they made a concerted editorial decision to not be aggressive and adversarial, but to be careerist and to go along with the prevailing narrative and sort of burnish their adversarial bona fides through Glenn Greenwald, over whom, again, they had no editorial control. And that's why, for example, they also published the really overhyped and overblown piece based on the Reality Winner leak about how Russia was trying to hack into voting systems. I mean, if you look at the actual document they based their article on, The document itself doesn't even show what they said it did. It was like a vague attribution to Russian hacking, but that was based on one analyst's judgment, and that was contextual information. They distinguished between contextual information and confirmed information, which it was not, but they ignored that. It also was basically a spear phishing attack that they were talking about, which they kind of minimized. Spear phishing is not a sophisticated hacking thing, as illustrated by the fact that whoever was carrying out this supposed massive attack on our election system was using a Gmail address, impersonating a voting company with a Gmail address. And that's why when I had on James Risen, and I was back at the Real News and we discussed this issue, he couldn't defend the substance of the article, and he hung up on me. And I'll say also my former workplace, Democracy Now!, which is my favorite news show, has the most noble legacy, and I benefit a lot from it. But their top guest, this is Aaron Maté, their top guest on Russiagate was Marcy Wheeler, who is one of the most vocal conspiracy theorists out there. Dorr says, and revealed a source to the FBI, no? Maté, yes, that's right. She also turned in a source to the FBI, who she said played a key role in what she called Russia's attack on the election. Well, her source and her story are nowhere in the Mueller report, and we haven't heard her explain what happened there. And yet she was treated by many people as a sort of hero for turning in her source, which really she was actually violating one of the core tenets of journalism, which is don't turn your source into the government. And now we know, based on the fact that Mueller didn't go anywhere with it, that it was baseless, as was her entire conspiracy theory. So I'm not saying that these two outlets, Democracy Now! And The Intercept, were the worst, but the fact that even our most noble outlets could drink the Kool-Aid and go along with it really says something about how bad our media culture was. And Doré says that's why it was, and that's why it was emotionally wrenching for me to see places like Democracy Now!, The Intercept, The Young Turks, where I worked, push Russiagate. It destroyed me kind of internally. It was way worse than the coverage of the Iraq War for me, because at least during the Iraq War, most of the people on the left were awake about it, right? But this was ubiquitous. It was horrible. I looked up who was the editor. Betsy Reed is the editor-in-chief of The Intercept. Betsy Reed is the editor based in New York City. Glenn Greenwald's the co-founding editor. Now we know where he stood at. Then the other one is Jeremy Scahill. He's another co-founding editor. So I'm going to guess Betsy Reed sets the tone over there. Our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, comments at this point, where I think Dorr loses the thread is when Dorr claims that, quote, journalists are bigger screw-ups than comedians. Comedians have a higher standard than these people, journalists. Our researcher says I disagree. In fact, this is J.B. Nicholson, in fact, since I wrote a Counterpunch article, quote, Comedians as Sycophants, Samantha Bee, John Oliver, and the Democrats, in November 2016, there have been many other examples of comics on corporate TV who regularly display how compliant they are with the permanent government deep state interest in pushing Russiagate. Comics, even wealthy comics who can get other work, including Sarah Silverman, Harry Shearer, and Stephen Colbert, are readily available. The entire segment is a clear indictment of so-called alternative news, which is no alternative to the corporate-friendly news when it comes to Russiagate. That's the judgment of J.B. Nicholson, our researcher who monitors this stuff. You can see his almost unique article on comedians as political conduits for this sort of nonsense in Counterpunch, where it was published a year ago. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, recorded in the studios of Urbana Public Television on April 23rd in the 17th week of 2019. Another week in which everyone can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making, for which its principal criminal associates, the associates these days, are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel. U.S. government aids the Saudis in their near-genocidal war in Yemen, and the Israeli and their racist opposition of the Palestinian people. Such outrages cannot be dismissed as something that only happens in the global South. In the Illinois legislature, our own Representative Carol Ammons refused to vote against using UI funds to support Israeli apartheid, something Ammons would never have done for South African apartheid. On our show, we try to concentrate on the shamefully underreported news of U.S. war-making. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman with Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. We'll conclude tonight with Chris Hedges talking to Aaron Maté about the Russiagate nonsense. This is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.